What is going on, everybody? It's your boy John, and welcome back to Gearbox. So today I kind of wanted to follow the trend of the past couple videos on this channel as it relates to, uninstalling air suspension, installing coilovers, so on and so forth. But in this case, I want to talk about kind of a beginner's guide to aftermarket suspension, specifically coilovers, but this will apply to air suspension as well. I will actually be using my air suspension struts for demonstration. Just please note that they do transfer over 100% of the way. It's just one has an airbag, one has a shock on it. Not too terribly difficult to understand. But the first thing I want to talk about is actual strut height adjustment. That's something where when I was installing coilovers on my WRX, that was something I really wanted to make sure I had dialed in, transferring from the air suspension to the coilover before I put it on and had to take it right back off to make some major adjustments. So let's get right into part number one. So the first tool that you are going to want to make sure you have when you are dealing with coilovers, air suspension, whatever, is what's called spanner wrenches. These are going to be able to give you the torque to actually torque down the locking collar. So this right here and this right here. Now for those who have never dealt with, let's call it fully adjustable suspension, these locking collars are extremely important. If you didn't see my video when I first got my air suspension installed, this locking collar right here was not super tight. So this is the front, well, I guess the way it was oriented, this was the front right strut. This was not tight, so anytime I would go full lock in a turn, this thing would just rattle around and it was super sketchy and I had no idea what was going on. But these locking collars are going to ensure that the ride height that you set stays there and that the actual full unit of the strut stays in place. These spanning wrenches are going to allow you to do that. So typically what you'll do is you'll get on the top lock collar and go the opposite way on the bottom lock collar and be able to have, enough torque to turn the actual locking collars, not just for an adjustment standpoint, but really locking it in place. Now, one thing you will probably run into, these struts do not have it. These are True Heart Air struts. A lot of the locking collars and the ones I just put on the car, they actually have a little Allen key right about here. And that is going to allow you to not only tighten down this way, but also clamp essentially that locking collar to the strut assembly to make sure that there is no movement whatsoever. And it's one of those things where it's kind of tedious when you're doing it, but you're gonna thank yourself later when you install everything's running as anticipated, and you're really enjoying your ride on your new suspension setup. So while we're talking about locking collars, we definitely need to talk about how to actually set the ride height on your strut itself. So I'm not gonna do it to this strut. It's in a perfect place, and for the new owner, because I'm selling it, I want to keep it as such. But basically what you're going to do, if you can see here, this is all threaded, as well as the fact that there are threads down here as well. So in order to set this, really what you're going to do is start to spin this lower assembly left or right, which in turn goes up or down, to kind of get your base ride height set up. Now, this is something where on air suspension, because you have the luxury of air compressor, air tank, etc., you can dial that in your presets, and so it doesn't necessarily have to be perfect from the get-go. Me, as a guy with OCD, I couldn't stand if there were 4 different PSI settings on my presets. That would just drive me nuts. But basically what you're going to want to do here is you're going to set your ride height on this strut, and then you're going to match it to the other front strut. Or in the case of you're transferring from air suspension to coilovers, What I did was I took this strut out. I knew I had it at a reasonable ride height setting, so therefore the height of this strut would be somewhat of a resemblance of my actual ride height when it's under load on the car. Took measurements from the top hat to the lower assembly, and then just transferred that measurement over to the coilover. Once again, if you do need to make adjustments, loosen these locking collars up, spin this right or left to get your desired height, tighten them back up, and then you should be good to go. But that's one thing where I would strongly suggest taking the time to transfer those measurements and make sure they're dead on, from this front strut to that front strut, that rear strut to that rear strut, that air strut to that coilover. Whatever you do, you know, take some measurements, maybe make some educated guesses as far as, well, this suspension sat a little high, maybe I want to take 1/4 of an inch out of it and see where that puts us. But please keep in mind, especially for coilovers, it's going to take time for those springs and that suspension to actually settle. So what I mean by that is when you put the measurements on the coilover, you install the coilover, that's going to be a little bit different than once the car is actually sitting for a little bit and or driven, and just letting it kind of settle into place based on those presets that you gave them. It's not a massive difference, but you know, it's something to keep in mind. If you want to go slammed, well, make sure you don't slam it too much or your wheels aren't going to move. So anyway, that's going to be the ride height portion of this. Once again, I cannot tell you enough, please, please, please make sure that your locking collars are in place once your desired ride height is set. So we couldn't talk about aftermarket suspension without talking about this bad boy right here, AKA the top hat. Now, one of the big reasons why a lot of people, especially nowadays, will go to aftermarket suspension not in a performance setting is because of this. This top hat is going to give you significantly more play when it comes to camber adjustments. So you see guys running crazy wide wheels, crazy wide camber, whatever. This is going to give you so much more adjustment from the OEM camber bolts that it's going to allow you to run a lot more aggressive wheels. Now, camber is great, not my thing. Everyone needs a little bit of camber, but some of these guys are going crazy. More importantly, on the top hat is this bolt right here. This is going to be your dampening adjustment. Now, if you've been researching suspension or installs or whatever, you probably heard the word dampening thrown around quite a bit. Dampening is essentially, you know, you have the actual strut assembly, the shock absorber, whatever. Dampening is going to increase or decrease the amount of fluid that is pushed through the actual shock to give you a stiffer or smoother ride. That's one of the big things I'm excited about for my new coilover setup, is that although these are here on air suspension, I feel like it is more minute of adjustments because you have the, let's call it, for lack of a better term, squishiness of the airbag. With a coilover, you have your preload set, you have the spring rates, all that shit. But because you can go in there and have 30-way adjustable dampening, you can really, really, really dial in your ride. Now, a whole nother can of worms that we could open up is the idea of linear spring rate versus progressive spring rate. And we can talk about that, but for my case, it's a linear spring rate. So really, the whole, let's just put it this way, the dampening is going to do me good. But that's really, once again, that's going to be one of the main reasons why a lot of people are going to actually go to aftermarket suspension. Sure, everyone loves to lower their car and it looks good and it lowers the center of gravity and has some performance benefits, but because you can actually fully dial in your ride and make it as enjoyable as it possibly could be, I mean, that's worth every penny in my book. And that's really where a big decision for me to go aftermarket came from. And last but not least, one thing I do want to talk about, and it really has nothing to do with the strut or the top hat or this or that. It's more so a necessary evil when you are messing with suspension, and that is the fact that regardless of what you're doing suspension wise, you are going to have to go get an alignment. I know this might be shocking to some, maybe it's a stupid comment to others. I just want to, throw it out there for the record. Please go get an alignment. You might think you have measurements perfect and you put everything back the exact same way it came out. That's not true. I know even with my car right now, I went for a quick little drive, just kind of shake down, make sure everything felt good, and it did. But I could tell, some of the toe, some camber definitely needs to be adjusted. So please keep that in mind. Don't go doing a suspension, job and then going on a long road trip unless you really, really enjoy spending money on new tires, because it's going to be miserable. So please make sure you go get aligned, and that's going to save you a lot of headache for the future. Anyway, guys, that is going to do it for another episode of Gearbox. If you have any questions, if there's anything I missed, please drop them in the comments down below. If you liked what you saw, please give this video a big fat thumbs up. As always, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell. You know the drill. And until next time, peace.